Namaskar and good morning, everyone. We are here with another interesting and informative session of India-Ireland Friendship Lecture Series with Dr. Swapna Liddle, who will be sharing her knowledge about the city of Delhi under the topic The Revolt of 1857 in Delhi, a landmark in the freedom movement. Dr. Swapna is a historian with a special interest in Delhi. She wrote her PhD thesis on cultural and intellectual change in Delhi under the rule of the East India Company, and then extended her study to the development of Delhi as an imperial capital city, particularly under Mughal and British rule. For many years, she has also been closely involved in the movement to preserve historic sites and monuments. She has also been the convener of the Delhi chapter of Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. She has written many articles for academic journals. She is the author of the books Connaught and the Making of New Delhi, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of Old Delhi, and Delhi 14 Historic Talks. Her most recent book is The Broken Script, Delhi under the East India Company and the Fall of the Mughal Dynasty, 1803 to 1857. Before we invite Dr. Swapna to enrich us with her extensive knowledge on Delhi, I would request His Excellency, the Ambassador of India, Shri Akhilesh Mishra, to give introductory remarks to today's topic.
Namaskar, my warm greetings to all friends who are connected with this program. It is a great privilege for us in the Indian Embassy to have someone like Dr. Swapna Liddle, who is very distinguished scholar and thinker and writer, and her contribution in making the history of Delhi publicly, like greater awareness about Delhi's cultural and socio-political history and transformation is very valuable. We are very delighted to have you. And it's particularly a joy for me to welcome you under India-Ireland Friendship Lecture Series, because this year is very special for us both. We are celebrating 175 years of India's independence, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, and our land completed 100 years of its independence in 2022. So this timing is very significant for us. And as India's ambassador in Ireland, I'm trying to study the past connection between India and Ireland, not only the historical, but also contemporary, and how do we take our partnership further. And in this context, I'm very keen with my support of my colleagues in the embassy to have a much broader based people-to-people connect. Between India and Ireland. We have had very, very deep ties, long-standing friendship, solidarity, and camaraderie, shared colonial experience, and your own area of scholarship would resonate a lot with audience here. And also Ireland has had tremendous impact on our own freedom struggle. They inspired in many ways. The Anushilan Samiti of West Bengal was inspired by Irish guerrillas. Home Rule movement of Ireland inspired similar movement in India. Annie Besant of Ireland, she was president of Indian National Congress at one point in time. And also there are very many connects between our two countries. And as I'm meeting historical institutions here and learning about the history and meeting scholars in Irish universities, I'm very convinced that it will be very productive for scholars, intellectuals, and thinkers or researchers from India and Ireland to get connected. And in that context, we have initiated this friendship lecture series so that without spending money, we disseminate stories about India in Ireland, and also similar stories about Ireland, which are important for Indian people to know. We are using this. And I'm looking forward to listening to your presentation very eagerly, because 1857 we call the first struggle of India's independence, and the British call it mutiny. But it was definitely it was not just a revolt or a mutiny of soldiers. It was a much broader, and to the extent possible, like concerted effort to get rid of the British. And that story also has a lot of resonance in Ireland, because Ireland was colonized for about 7 centuries. And there were many attempts by the Irish nationalist personalities to get their independence and get rid of the colonial rule. And one incident particularly has like similarity with 1857 is the Battle of Vinegar Hills, 1798. So in which about 13,000 British government forces and about 16,000 Irish soldiers had a really pitched battle, in which about 1,200 Irish people lost life. Similarly, in the East, in 1916, there was Easter Rising for Irish Republican forces. There are very many connects and struggles that Ireland had to gain independence and become a republic, and we also had a long, varied struggle. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, and I'll be happy to connect with you some renowned historians of Ireland who are doing work on contemporary, like the period of your interest. I think this is a great beginning, and thank you so much for accepting our kind invitation. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Ambassador Mishra, thank you so much. Namaskar, and for giving me this opportunity to talk a little bit about my research into a subject which, as you quite rightly say, really is something that is a part of our shared relationship with Ireland. India and Ireland, we have had anti-colonial struggle as a large part of our formative years of our nationhood. And I would therefore, in fact, I felt that talking about 1857, my own area of expertise is Delhi, and therefore the focus of this little talk is also going to be Delhi. But I think it in many ways talks about what were the kinds of things that were motivating factors in this uprising, how, you know, what is it that happened, and what can it tell us about the freedom movement in general? What can, and you know, as you rightly said, that we learn from each other, and maybe if we draw parallels between Irish history and our history, we can learn something more about how people's movements like this, particularly against foreign domination, etc., how they played out, how people, you know, finally get to assert themselves and, you know, strive towards their independence. So therefore, as the talk says, this is a landmark in India's freedom movement. So it's very appropriate when we are, both nations are, you know, celebrating independence from freedom from, you know, colonial domination, that we should talk about this. Now, I'd like to start by just talking, for the benefit of those who may not be very familiar with what 1857 and its significance is, and especially about Delhi's history of that period. 1857, of course, is a general revolt that broke out, a revolt as in a complete rejection of British rule. A rejection of British rule by all sorts of, it started as a mutiny of soldiers, but then it soon spread to large sections of the population, whether it is the agricultural population or it is artisans in the cities, whether it is the rulers of semi-independent states, which were still there in India at that point. It became a widespread revolt, particularly through large parts of North and Central India. British rule almost got wiped out at that point. So, but the fact that ultimately the revolt was suppressed, the British rule, of course, continued, and it was brutally suppressed. But that doesn't take away from the fact that this was really, in many senses, the first real struggle for independence, which was on such a large scale. Because there had been sporadic incidents, but for such a large scale, this is, therefore we affectionately call this the first War of Independence in India. So to speak of Delhi at this point, before a little bit of background of history, Delhi at this point, 1803, the East India Company had conquered Delhi. They had, and before the East India Company, it was the Marathas who were ruling Delhi, specifically Scindia. The Scindia ruler was ruling Delhi. The Mughal emperor continued to stay here, but he was, so the Marathas ruled on behalf of the Mughal emperor, but it was the Marathas who ruled. So the British East India Company defeated the Scindia forces to gain control over Delhi. And they became then the rulers of Delhi. And again, for at least for a while, ruling in the name of the Mughal emperor. But the Mughal emperor was reduced not only to, I mean, less than a puppet. Initially, he was a puppet. Later, he was just what they called a pensioner sitting in the Red Fort. So he did not have any real power. It is this situation, which continued for a long time, as I said, from 1803 to 1857, that on the 10th of May in Meerut, soldiers revolted. They mutinied against their officers, they killed officers, they looted the arsenal, and then, you must realize that the soldiers had some grievances, mainly the grievance that is talked about. There were various, but the main triggering factor was the question of the Enfield rifle and the greased cartridge question, as it is called. The point was that there was this cartridge, the cover of which was supposed to be torn off before it used to be, loaded on. And that cover was really rumored to be greased with cow fat and pig fat. Now, these are substances that were absolutely abhorrent to whether it was Muslim soldiers or Hindu soldiers. So, this was obviously a very, very great grievance they had, and they had refused to use this rifle on this count. And that was a triggering factor. The mutiny happens. Now, these soldiers, once they revolt, they decided to come to Delhi. And the reason for coming to Delhi was a very simple one. In a lot of people's minds, Delhi was the capital. For a long time, it had been the capital of the Mughal Empire. And in fact, even till the early 19th century, many of the states, the princely states their coinage used to have the name of the Mughal emperor on it. Even the Marathas, Holkar, Scindia, etc., they used to have the Mughal emperor's name on their coinage. The East India Company also used to have the name of the Mughal emperor on their coinage. So with this whole idea, even though the empire had long gone, they had no actual political power, but the idea that the Mughal emperor is a sort of a fount of authority, or Delhi is the true capital of the nation, they came to Delhi. And they came to Delhi, they arrived 11th May 1857, early in the morning. And with them, they came and they stood under the palace, the Red Fort in Delhi, and they appealed to the Mughal emperor to let them in and to become their leader in their war to overthrow the British. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah, he's known as Bahadur Shah Zafar because that was his name, and his takhallus in poetry, he was a great poet as well. So he, initially he had a few misgivings, but then he did join in. But, the soldiers came in, the soldiers came into the city, and there were soldiers also in Delhi, and all of them joined up with these mutinous soldiers. So they threw off the yoke of British rule in the sense that they decided that they would not follow their officers anymore. And of course, the first result of that was violence, because the only way they could make sure that they could retain their independence, which they had got temporarily, they had to kill all their officers. So all the British officers were killed. Many whoever, some escaped, but they tried to kill all their officers. Families, a lot of people who were thought might be supporters of the British lost their lives in this as well. So this was sort of this was a necessary amount, which they thought it was a necessary amount of violence which needed to secure their rule. Though, of course, particularly there were members of the royal family, including the emperor, who was very unhappy about women and children being killed. So that was a somewhat divisive thing, but anyway, this is what happened. But there was violence of another sort also, and that was because with the soldiers coming here, with violence breaking out, there was a lot of opportunistic people who joined in. Now that often happens in times of when there is disorder, when an administration breaks down. Remember, you had British rule, suddenly that is withdrawn, there is disorder, there is a lack of administration, there's lack of rule, and therefore a lot of the criminal elements also took advantage of this situation. So there was some amount of disorder on that, particularly on that first few days after the revolt, and there was looting of shops, etc. Some of them, these were European shops, and therefore the looting was as a sort of as a symbolic gesture against foreign rule. But there was also against some institutions which were seen as being colonial institutions, like the college, the Delhi College, which was the first Western style institution of higher learning in Delhi. So that was attacked. But also there was some amount of attack on rich Indian people also. Mm-hmm. And sometimes a pretext was used that they are hiding British people and all that. But we can very clearly see that often it was those opportunistic people who are slow, who take advantage of that to try and loot. Now, what happens with all this disorder, all this violence in the first few days, that the soldiers who had come and the Mughal emperor and the royal family and some influential people of the city decided to get together to organize the administration. Now here, I think what we have is, and of course the soldiers and the royal family and the emperor were against the looting. They did not want this disorder. This was happening, because of the breakdown, but their main aim was to prevent any such thing happening. So they actually, it's very interesting that they set up what they called a court of administration. They set up a court of administration. And that court of administration is actually very interesting because it shows us an early example of a governing system in a modern sense, which is beyond monarchy. It is not just the rule of a king or an emperor. But it is a court of administration. It was supposed to have nominated members from the soldiers, because the soldiers were a very important stakeholder in that, because the soldiers were the ones, and it was not just the Meerut soldiers, it was not just the Delhi soldiers, but in time, soldiers from all over North and Central India started converging on Delhi. Because once the news spread that this uprising had started against British rule, a lot of soldiers all over started to mutiny. They started to mutiny, and once they mutinied, they decided they will come to Delhi to join in the fight against the British. So they start converging on Delhi. So they are a very important, as I said, stakeholder in this. And so they, half of the court of administration is made up of members from the soldiery, which different regiments, they were different regiments from different parts. They were, nominated their members. Other members were from prominent citizens of Delhi. And of course, some positions were held by members of the royal family as well. So you have this court of administration, which very soon actually starts to lay down proper rules as to how administration will be run, how revenue will be collected, how there will be a control on violence, so that anybody who is indulging in looting, they will be punished and stopped. So these kind of it begins to happen, that you start putting this administration in place. Now, the problem, of course, also was that even though the intentions were often very good, the administration suffered from a lot of disadvantages. First of all, you suddenly have a city that is without its normal administration. You have to put a completely different structure in place. And the British also had started to regroup. They get reinforcements from the north, from Punjab, from Simla, where a lot of the troops were posted. Troops started converging on Delhi. And very soon, within a month of the revolt, you have the British back. And they then position themselves outside the city walls and besiege the city. Mm-hmm. So in a siege-like situation, it is very difficult to keep order going. And their resources were very, very constrained because of that. Because though it was not a complete siege ever, they had channels of communication, but it was difficult to get around the countryside. It is difficult to get supplies of food, other kinds of supplies. Their gunpowder was always short. They had a great problem keeping up manufacture in order to keep the war going. So these kind of, and of course, the fact that in a city which had a population of, say, 150,000, you add about 75,000 people from outside, soldiers who have come. Now, for those soldiers to house them, to feed them, to keep them supplied with all their necessities, it's a huge strain on the city. And that, so these are kind of things which did put a lot of strain on the city. There was also the fact that militarily, it was a difficult situation, because militarily, if you look at the British Indian Army, Indians had never been admitted to the higher official class. I think Subedar was the maximum, the highest position that an Indian could get in the army. So, if you have never been given a higher command, you don't have that kind of experience of leadership in a military situation. So the Indian army did suffer from that drawback. They did not have people with experience of command and leadership. Nevertheless, the Indians always fought very bravely. When the British had come back to lay siege in June, they thought that very soon now we will overcome the city and we will win. But actually from June to September, another 3 months it took before they could finally break through. So 4 months, Delhi ran an independent administration free of British rule. It was a sort of government of independent India at that point. So that is what this administration was. Now, in many ways, this, as I said, it is a landmark also because one obvious thing is that the scale of the uprising is a definite landmark, but it is also a landmark in the kinds of ways people struggle, the kinds of ways in which they justify their struggle. And here I must say that the British, how they characterized the revolt was by saying that this is a matter of religious sentiment. that Indians, there's the soldiers, so they called it just a mutiny, right? Because for them, it was just a mutiny. The soldiers had mutinied because they were angry about the rifle. Now, what we see is, of course, the rifle and the greased cartridge issue was a triggering issue. But the reason why so many people join it, and ultimately all across North and Central India, there are diverse groups of people who are joining it, not just soldiers, diverse groups of people who are joining in. And they have certain grievances. We can see them in some of the proclamations that are, for instance, made from Delhi, from the Delhi Court of Administration, when they are calling other people, when they are issuing, proclamations, and they are saying, like, there are grievances. So they are talking about that. I will come to the grievances again later. But what exactly is the place of religious sentiment in 1857? That is a factor that has to be looked at. And as I said, it's not the main factor, because I will talk about other factors also. But at a time when our modern form of national sentiment, nationalism, today we have this idea of a nation, a national flag, the constitution, we think of nationhood in those terms, but these are somewhat modern concepts. And before that whole idea of nationalism takes complete form, there are, and even after it takes complete form, of course, religion can be a strong motivating factor. And when the ideologues of 1857, when they saw that they have to motivate the population against so many odds, as I said, it was difficult for them to motivate a population against so many odds to take up arms and to be committed to the cause of opposing the British, then they found that religion was a very useful rhetoric to use. So it's a powerful emotional instrument that it uses. And one of the sources that I read and I find very interesting is a newspaper of that time. It was called the Delhi Urdu Akhbar. And the Delhi Urdu Akhbar always used to, and it changed its name during the revolt to Akhbarul Zafar. Zafar means victory. So he's one of the issues of in the Delhi Urdu Akhbar, the editor, who was Muhammad Bakir, he said that God is on the side of, it's on our side. God is on our side of the people who are rising up against this foreign rule. And what are the signs that God is on our side? See, he has wiped out the British. He enabled us to wipe out the British from the city. And history proved that when this happened, and it had happened many times before, even the weak could overcome the strong. So he's trying to say that when God removes, God is on our side. So even if we are weak, we can remove a strong power. And it has happened many times in the past also. And one example that he gave was that when Ram, with a relatively small army, had defeated the mighty Ravan. And then he says that Krishna had put down the tyrant Kans. So he says that even if you are weak, if God is on your side, you can defeat a strong power. So religion, therefore, could be a motivating factor. It was used like that, which is not to say that religion was the main, reason for the grievance. It was not the main reason for the grievance, but it was definitely a rhetoric that could be used. So what were the actual grievances of the people who joined the revolt? There were many, depending on what background you came from. So again and again, we see references to high taxes. The British had increased taxes a lot. It had confiscated a lot of jagirdaris. People's lands had been confiscated. People's tenure, if you were a landowner, of course, your jagidaris were often resumed. But if you were a cultivator, for instance, often your tenure became a little less secure. So that also was a problem. There was a loss of jobs because a lot of, as I said, in the armies, Indians could not be recruited, were not recruited to the higher posts. Even in the administration, the Indians were confined to the lower positions, which had lower responsibilities and lower pays. So this was the loss of jobs was a major grievance. So these kind of things. Also, there was a good understanding of how racist British rule actually was. And I will quote one line from what Muhammad Baqir in the Delhi Urdu Akhbar said. He says कि जो ब्रिटिश ने 100 बरस के इस्तिकलाल से सल्तनत खल्क के खुदा को हकीर और तुम्हारे भाई बंदों को काला आदमी करके जलील और ख्वार किया है. So he said that after 100 years, these British have been referring to God's creation as black man, and they have dishonored and disgraced us by using these racial slurs. So this was a very deeply felt feeling, a deeply felt grievance that of a racial thing. Now, race, of course, is something that is easily understood by those who are at the receiving end of racial discrimination. But we also see the evidence of a surprisingly mature understanding of the economic exploitation of colonial rule. And that is I'm saying it's surprisingly mature because it takes a while to actually get the understanding of what exactly colonial rule does. So, we have Dadabhai Nauroji and his drain of wealth theory. And here in the Delhi Urdu Akhbar, you see some signs of an early understanding of this. So one of the, issues of the Delhi Urdu Akhbar, he talks about how the, powder and, this is the early days of the Akhbar, and he's talking about some of the looting that is happening in the government establishments, and he says that these things have been collected by the British by cutting and burning the throats and hearts of the people. So he says that, how colonial wealth has been built up by exploitation of Indian people. Then he talks, of course, of many of the jagirdaris and livelihoods which have been taken by the British. But again, one of the things he says that during British rule, all higher positions have been given to Indians, all jobs of profit have been given to the British, and therefore these people have collected large amounts of money which they do not spend in India. They take it abroad, they save that money and they transfer it to their country. So that money which they are transferring to their country is not being spent in India. What he's trying to do, he's talking about that drain of wealth, because he is saying that even previous rulers, they used to collect taxes, they used to collect money, but then they spent that money in India. They didn't take it away anywhere else. So they spent it in India, but the British are different because they are taking this money away outside the country, because when the money remains in the country, it is spent in the country, it promotes economic growth. So this is what he is saying. So I think that this is very interesting as a precursor to the drain of wealth theory, which was formulated and detailed out so well by Dadabhai Nauroji. He, the newspaper, and it is probably the editor, Muhammad Baqir, who says this. Now, as I said, all this is all very well, but as I said, there were points of fissure in the city also. There were points of tension. The rich are thinking that their property is being threatened because the soldiers keep demanding more money, and the soldiers can't help it because they have to run the war. So they are putting pressure on the well-off to give money. So the rich start to, really feel that, is this worth it? and often happens that there is a little bit of status quoist mentality in some people. So they started thinking seriously about this. They were also threatened, the elite in the city were also threatened by a little bit of upward mobility that was being shown by some of the lower classes. So they said that people, when the bank was looted, I told you that there was some amount of looting by the poor, opportunistic looting when the revolt broke out. So they feel that these people have gathered money, they have now armed themselves, they're also, so they played a very important role, but they felt the rich started feeling that these people might then, in their term, they felt that these were people who were getting above themselves, who were getting power in their hands. So some amount of class antagonism begins to set in. There is always a little bit of some amount of sectarian difference which happens, but the sectarian difference, and there had been earlier in Delhi's history occasions of some amount of sectarian difference, but by and large, the soldiers and the Mughal emperor kept this problem in check. So actually, which some historians have said that one thing that divided the revolt was sectarian violence or sectarian differences. I don't agree with that, because what I find in the sources that I have looked at, it was actually kept in check. It was not as if it divided the movement at all. As I have indicated earlier, what was a problem and what ultimately led to the defeat of the movement was a lack of resources. They were hard, and despite what the rich felt, the soldiers did not forcibly loot the rich people or their their valuables. So there was always a problem. There was a military lack, also lack of gunpowder, lack of organization. Also, as I said, these were not soldiers with great experience of leadership. So a lot of that was there. So despite the bravery, ultimately the British prevailed because they managed to gather and the British, their priority was to get Delhi, because they realized that Delhi was becoming such a powerful center of the revolt that if they did not defeat Delhi, then they would be, their existence in India was threatened. So they made it a priority to recapture Delhi. And therefore, they got all their resources together, concentrated it on Delhi. Finally, on the 14th of September, 1857, a little over 4 months since the revolt had broken out, they finally break down one of the gates of the city, the northern gate, which is the Kashmiri gate, and they break into the city. It took them, by that time, a lot of the soldiers, realizing that Delhi would fall, had moved away from Delhi because they wanted to continue the revolt. So they moved to other places so that they would be able to fight. I mean, they didn't want to be captured because that would mean an end of the revolt. They didn't want to do that. So they moved on, and then they go on, and the rest of UP and all that, the revolt continues. So Delhi falls. And then, of course, it took the British it took them a week to capture the rest of the city because there was a stiff resistance by the Indians who were left there. Even civilians tried their best to keep them out. But ultimately, it was not possible. Many were killed, and many were just killed indiscriminately first. And then later, summary trials were held, very, very brief trials, naam ke vaste, but not really seriously. Lot of looting. All the property was looted, confiscated. Large parts of Delhi eventually were even demolished. So, in fact, if you look at the Red Fort today, about more than 90% of the buildings inside are gone from that period. Very few were left. They were all gone. The British army occupied the Red Fort. The people of Delhi were thrown out and not allowed to come back for many, many months. So you have this city that is completely, shall we say, devastated and doesn't recover for a long, long time. Uh, in fact, I always think that poetry often sums up these things very well. And one poet of Delhi, Mirza Khan Dagh, he's called Dagh Dehlvi, he talks about what happened. And, they then later thought of this city as something that was great, which was now gone. And he says, ये शहर वो है कि हर जिन्सो जान का दिल था, ये शहर वो है हर कदरदान का दिल था, ये शहर वो है कि हिंदुस्तान का दिल था, ये शहर वो है कि सारे जहान का दिल था. So in a hyperbolic frame, he talks about Delhi. This is the city that was the heart of every human being. This is the city that was the heart of every benefactor. This is the city that was the heart of Hindustan. This is the city that was the heart of the whole world. So therefore, the British, by making sure that they recaptured Delhi and defeated the revolt in Delhi, for them it marks a major turning point for them, because it demoralized the Indian side, it encouraged the British side. And so it was from then onwards. Of course, it was not the only place, because the revolt was very widespread and it continued. So many places remained free of British rule, but Delhi had this symbolism that was there. But of course, many places had an actively shook off British rule and kept it off for many months, even years. But it was only by the end of 58 that large parts of British rule were again restored. But 1857 is a very, very landmark moment in our freedom struggle. It marks the beginning of sort of a general nationwide rising up against colonial rule, which finds its culmination in 1947 with the complete independence of India. So this is the story of one chapter of that revolt, which is the Delhi story. And I hope I have been able to put together a basic idea of what the city was, how people were motivated, what was going on, why did it fail, and maybe a little bit about its legacy, because it, of course, led to the writing of stories of valor. It led to the writing of poetry, which people then used as inspirational poetry, and ideas like The Drain of Wealth, for instance, where you have this early understanding of what nationhood is, what colonial exploitation is, what are the actual consequences of colonial exploitation. So these are a few landmark things that happened in Delhi at this time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Swapna ji. It was very interesting and also very informative. I myself was taking notes copiously and learned so much. And a lot of points you have given me for my own study and research. Particularly interesting was like combination of factors, whether high taxes or land-related issues or racial discrimination. There are a lot, like these are, I have not seriously examined those issues. Very, very fascinating. And also the role of the elite. Also studying and observing Ireland. So there are many very significant parallels between what you have described and what our friends in Ireland tell us about their own struggle. And colonial powers naturally rule colonies by very strategy of dividing. And everywhere they went, they had very, very sophisticated, extensive intelligence network and network of informers. And the kind like issues you mentioned during our struggle, the similar kind of stories we hear here in Ireland also. And also the suspected allies and informers of the British, so they were also targeted by nationalist forces there and in Ireland as well. It's a very fascinating presentation that you gave, and I think we need to follow up with something interesting, like many more such conversations. And I do believe that will be very useful for you to have a kind of free discussion with scholars here who specialize on modern Irish history.
Right. Thank you so much. It's been a great privilege for me to be a part of this. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.